You're able to join us this afternoon. Well, more testimony in the last hour about racism in cricket. This time, it's not a player who suffered racism in the changing room or on the field. It's an administrator, someone who once held a top job in the running of Cricket South Africa. Thabang Moroe, a former CEO of Cricket South Africa. Firdose Moonda is an ESPNcricinfo Southern Africa cricket correspondent. Firdose, good afternoon to you. It's quite difficult to sort of sum up what happened at Cricket South Africa while Thabang Moroe was there. He's been making claims just in the last few minutes about how the South African media covered him, their attitude to him. He's been quite critical, I think, of some of the South African media. You at one point were barred, your accreditation was rejected or revoked by actions of Thabang Moroe. How do you see what he's been saying so far?
Yeah, I found Thabang's testimony overall really interesting, particularly the part about the appointing of the national coach. Look, in terms of the media, I think there was definitely a time at the start of Thabang's tenure where he was being written about, perhaps in what he would perceive as unfair terms. And my own feeling was that there was a racial undertone to it at some point. I think what we can't deny is that Thabang Moroe was fired for very extreme cases of misconduct. You know, we've all been privy to the report, the mis-expenditure of Cricket South Africa funds, as well as things like the fact that he was hired as the CEO without the proper qualifications. So it's light and shade, isn't it? We're seeing a lot of different sides of the same problem here. And I think we have to be careful not to cast characters as all good or all bad. Definitely the state that Thabang Moroe left Cricket South Africa in was appalling. You know, we reached that crisis point in December of 2019. At the same time, he's making some really interesting revelations about the process that led to that chaos.
I mean, in a way, it's also about, you know, who wanted to be the position. It doesn't seem that this was really a position that he wanted in the first place. And that leads to, I suppose, conversations about the dynamics in our country that led to the situation he found himself in. I mean, I don't want to say he didn't have personal agency, but he was in a difficult position in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to really go back to the failure of Cricket South Africa to launch the T20 Global League, because that was supposed to be the tournament that put South Africa on a par with boards like the ECB, perhaps not quite the BCCI in India, but, you know, to have a marquee T20 tournament would really have separated Cricket South Africa from the rest and put them in a different league. That didn't happen. We don't really know what the infighting around that was. We still don't know. It's been a good few years now. And the departure of Haroon Lorgat and the appointing of Thabang Moroe, you know, he's also making some claims there about the former president, Chris Ntsebeza, and the role that Chris Ntsebeza had in terms of kind of overseeing a power shift, I suppose is the best way to describe it. But definitely, I think during the tenure, and Thabang was around for a couple of years, we saw a lot happen. You know, Cricket South Africa lost a lot of money. The team's performances were terrible. The relationship with the South African Cricketers Association broke down. The relationship with the media, I suppose, broke down as well. I'm laughing, but I guess it's really not that funny.
Well, I mean, I sort of understand what happened, you know, part of what happened. I sort of understand why you laugh and why it's not funny all at the same time. Because, I mean, in a way, this was, I think, perhaps almost a uniquely South African tragedy. There were so many aspects of, really, our broken society, the completely legitimate and correct push for transformation, the difficulties that creates, and then just internal politics in an organization here.
Absolutely. I think that this is what we're seeing through the entire SJN, to be honest with you, is that those issues that South Africa, not just South African cricket, the country as a whole, has been dealing with since the early 90s, they've never actually gone away. We've never had our moment of reckoning. We've never really challenged mindsets. You know, Rushdie Majid, who was the convener of selectors through a lot of this time period that the players are talking about at the moment, I remember him saying to me years ago, part of the difficulty with pushing the transformation agenda, or at least just pushing fairness, we don't even have to use the T word if we don't want to, is that the old mindsets haven't changed. And so it's really difficult to get people who grew up believing that people of color couldn't play cricket, weren't qualified to play cricket, and weren't good enough, could be selected in the team. And I remember Rushdie telling that to me when I started my career as a journalist, you know, more than a decade and a half ago now. And I just thought, oh, that's so kind of, it's so telling of what we see, because, you know, even in the language that's used, players of color are often criticized more. They're dropped easier. The way they're written about is different. And all of this needs to change. We need an overhaul of everything. So I realize this is just hearings that are limited to cricket, But I think it's showing us a mirror of ourselves as a society. And, I don't really like all of what we're seeing.
I mean, it's back to the role that cricket's played since the early 1990s. It's been hugely aspirational. We wanted proof that our country was changing. That put pressure on people. And yet the establishment hit back hard. You could argue that what happens is really signified by our economy as well. It's exactly the same sort of dynamics. And you do see this in other societies that have gone through change as well.
Absolutely. I guess we shouldn't be surprised. I think a lot of people have asked me the question since the hearing started whether the revelations were shocking. They are shocking, but they are not that surprising because of exactly what you say, that there was an establishment, there's been efforts to change, inevitably there's been pushback. I think maybe what we didn't realize is how big the pushback was, how strong it was, but also how hurtful. Because some of the things that we're hearing from players, and I'm talking from Omar Henry, who spoke about actually both sides of it. He was rejected by his own community and then rejected by the establishment white community, to what we heard yesterday, Ashwell Prince, talking about feeling othered. And these are things you can't quantify. It's not as though Ashwell Prince can bring us receipts. He can just say, I felt unwelcome. Nobody made an effort to make me feel like I was part of something. How do you explain that with, in words other than the ones I've just used? So I think we need to leave space for people to hear their stories. We have to understand that part of decolonizing our minds and our spaces is understanding that there's an oral part of this that we've just never really reckoned with. There's a history that needs to be addressed, and there are feelings that we have to take into account. I realize that might sound a little bit soft, but I really think that's where we are.
Well, I think, with feelings, from the word feelings comes another word, which is healing. And I would argue that these processes are probably around that. I do want to ask you about, so the personnel, right, the individuals. Now, we can talk about damage to society. This damages individuals. I would argue Thabang Moroe is probably one of those, although, again, I don't want to take away the personal agency that he had at certain times. We've seen big changes at cricket and in Cricket South Africa. There's a new board. There's a whole new broom, except that some of what we've heard at the hearings involves people in important positions now. And I'm talking, there's one example, I think it's Mark Boucher. There have been claims made against him. He now has a senior position. He now is going to have to account for what happened. He said that he will. It asks then the question, is Cricket South Africa, is cricket in South Africa really changing?
Yeah, on the evidence of what we've heard, I almost want to say I don't think it changed for a really long time. I think what we haven't heard is from people involved in the national setup right now, and I think the question needs to be extended to them. Has anything changed from Ashwell Prince, who was only 10 years ago? It wasn't really that long ago. And I do think also that those who've been implicated, well, we know that they will be offered the right of reply. We don't know how many of the people that have been implicated, and I'm talking about people across teams from the 90s and the 2000s, will actually make use of that right of reply. I imagine that those who are involved in the system today would have to, not necessarily because anybody's telling them to, but because I think if you're going to continue to work in cricket, then you have to be part of this moment. And, whether it's to rebut things, whether it's to explain things, whether it's to give a different side of the story, whatever it is, I think it's really important that people come, make their voices heard, and really get to grips with these claims, because what you're getting is a group of people in a team who's saying, I felt like you didn't want me there. I felt like you made me feel as though I didn't deserve to be there. So those feelings need to be addressed. Obviously, there's also been some really terrible stories of racism. Ashwell Prince told a story about what people in the change room were calling fans of Indian heritage in Durban around 2006 or 7. We've heard some of the language that's being used, and I think that needs to be explained. I am someone of Indian heritage. I wouldn't want the team that claims to represent me using those terms to talk about people like me. And if I'm going to support them, then I need to know that they are actually representing this whole country with all our mixed heritage and diversity and background, and not using terminology like that.
There's also a conversation, I suppose, about the media. And again, I speak as someone in the media, I suppose, so I need to be very careful. But it's very complicated, but you will have your own experience of what it's been like in the cricket press box. I'd imagine it hasn't always been comfortable.
No, definitely not. When I started out many years ago, I was one of very few women, and a lot of times on tour, the only woman around. And some of the early things, some of the gender-specific jokes, I'm trying not to use words that could be offensive, I didn't enjoy. I also didn't enjoy, people like looking through their binoculars out onto the grass embankments to see what type of ladies they could spot there. There was a misogynist culture around the press box. I think that some of that has changed over the years. I think where we're at now as a media industry is that we've got to the point where there's a kind of older establishment, and then there's the younger people and the people who are a little bit more progressive. And we're having a little bit of a battle along those lines. And I think you've seen some of it play out on social media, where also, everybody works for a different organization. Everybody's got different demands from their employers in terms of what they need to produce, how they need to interpret things, how certain things need to be covered. But I think we are seeing differences in that regard, and we're also seeing certain things coming out of certain places. There's certain publications who are reporting on the SJN daily. There are others who are naming names. There are others who are taking slightly different angles. There's some people who are ignoring it in totality. So I think it's for the readers and the listeners and the viewers to go and really look at who is doing what and who is saying what, but then also, to read between the lines sometimes, because I think that's what we're finding the players are talking about. The way a brown-black player is described, the way their form is described, compared to the way a white player is described. And sometimes it's very subtle. That's a lot of racism, isn't it? It's implicit. It's just kind of there. And I think if you look hard, you will really find that there are people who have really written in certain ways for a very long time and whose views really need to be questioned.
Firdose Moonda, thank you. ESPNcricinfo Southern Africa correspondent. I really do appreciate the time on Newsfeed this afternoon.